But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly two men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you, while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again." Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened.
Amazed at what had happened. This film began in darkness as we sat with Jesus in the sealed tomb, and then burst into life as we began celebrating the resurrection. But what's striking is that for the Easter moment, Luke in his story presents us only with the empty tomb. We don't meet the risen Jesus himself until later in the story on the road to Emmaus. And since this week we've been sitting with the passion narrative of Luke, letting it speak to us on its own terms, then we're just going to allow the tension to build as he continues to guide us through the story. Luke, it seems, wants us to avoid skipping to the end of the story too quickly, hiding ourselves in the happy ending without first going on the journey. And Luke seems to acknowledge that at times that journey is painful and difficult. Sitting with Jesus in the darkness is not what we want to do, but it is important to sit in the darkness because this is what Jesus has come for. If we too easily gloss over his suffering and death, then we can belittle our own experience of suffering and death too, and the experience of human suffering entirely. And if we do that, we're likely to miss the saving power of Jesus in our own lives. These days when Jesus is dead really matter, because Jesus does not fob off the suffering of the world, he inhabits it. Only if we first sit with Christ in the sealed tomb can we be amazed at what has happened when we meet the empty tomb. Only then can we realise, as the prayer of baptism puts it, that we are buried with him in his death, in order that we might share in his resurrection. Only if we're buried with Christ in his death is there any hope of an end to suffering and death. Jesus, our Good Shepherd, came to guide us through the valley of the shadow of death, so that we might fear no evil. He is always present with us. Suffering is not a sign that God has forsaken us, but rather is a sign of his power to save in every situation through the power of his cross. When we are buried with Christ in his death, everything we fear, everything that could destroy us, is itself dead. And we find to our amazement that we can live. The whole passion narrative of Luke that is laid before us is a love unknown that subverts everything we think we know about the way the world works. And now even death itself turns out only to be death for our guilt and condemnation. But for us and for Jesus, it is new life. Seen through the story of the cross and the sealed tomb, the empty tomb becomes an experience of extraordinary power that leaves us amazed at what has happened and completely and utterly transformed. And the transformation is not just for us, but for the whole way the world itself is ordered. For one thing, it is empowering to the weak. If we've not already got that message from watching the dying figure of Christ, we have it reinforced now. The very women who we last saw watching Jesus die now become the first witnesses of the empty tomb. Women in first century Judea were not considered reliable witnesses. They were not allowed, for example, to give evidence in court. Everyone knew that they were inclined to gossip and fanciful nonsense, No wonder the disciples thought that their story was just an idle tale. No one took women seriously, except perhaps Jesus. He seems to have taken them very seriously indeed. One of the many unexpected twists in the plot is that Jesus chose for his first witnesses the very people whose evidence was most likely to be disregarded by the world. The last have become the first, the least have become the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and the voiceless have been entrusted with the greatest message of all: Christ is risen. And slowly, but surely, over the next few chapters of Luke's Gospel, that transformative effect takes hold one by one of those who have come to witness the resurrection for themselves and are amazed at what has happened. And by the end of the story, we're left in no doubt that we too can become witnesses of the resurrection and have our own transformative experience, and can ourselves be amazed at what has happened. There are many forms of darkness that Jesus inhabits in his 3 brief days in the sealed tomb. It's not just the physical suffering and death. It's the darkness of the world beyond our control, the world of Pilate and Herod. It's the darkness of our own minds, when we somehow allow ourselves to believe that the darkness is greater than the light and that we should abandon hope. And it is also the darkness of our own self-condemnation, that which is perhaps the most destructive force within us. There is no condemnation so crippling as that which we speak over ourselves. In the dread silence of our own hearts, perhaps the sealed tomb of Jesus still lurks, the last place that we are willing to sit or to look into. People often dislike the idea of God's judgment because they believe it will be condemning. But that's not God's judgment, but rather our own, and that of the world around us. The world around us condemns us because they need to condemn us in order to feel better about themselves. When we submit to their judgment, we will always find it to be harsh and unfair. And then, because we, in the dark secrets of our hearts, already believe that we are condemned, we believe their judgment, and believe that God also will condemn us. But the empty tomb of Jesus tells us that we shouldn't believe that condemnation anymore. Rather, we should be amazed at what has happened and believe instead in the Son who did not come into the world to condemn the world, but rather that through him the world might be saved. The old condemned us died on that cross and was buried in that sealed tomb of Jesus. But in the resurrection of Jesus, we are reborn. The grave has lost its victory. Death has lost its sting. Amazed at what has happened, we need no longer fear any condemnation, because even if it were true that we were the worst, the least, the most worthless souls on this earth, in the death and resurrection of Jesus, the last have become the first. The least sinner who has repented has become the cause of the greatest joy in heaven. Those most worthy of death are alive, and the voiceless are given the greatest message of all. Christ is risen. Alleluia.
Laudate Dominum, laudate Dominum, omnes gentes, Alleluia. Laudate Dominum, laudate Dominum, omnes gentes, Alleluia. Praise the Lord, all you nations, praise God, all you peoples, Alleluia. Strong is God's love and mercy, always faithful. Gente